Colleagues that love to write exam questions are always so interested to have a conversation with. As we talk about the exam blueprint and the value of really mapping to the exam, we know a key step in that process is figuring out, first of all, how do we effectively evaluate our students with the questions that we are developing for the exam? How many questions should we include? What should the STEM include? What should the STEM not include? What about those distractors? How do we know they're effective? How do we write effective distractors in a way that's going to attract our students who are not knowledgeable about the concepts? And also, how do we make sure our correct options are going to attract those students that are very knowledgeable about the concepts and to reach that higher threshold of scoring well on the exam? Well, we're going to talk about some of those elements. Specifically, what are those best practices that we should follow to develop valid, reliable, and fair exams? You want to go ahead and pull out Billings and Halstead if you haven't already, and it's going to be on chapter 478. These are going to be some guidelines that we'll be discussing throughout our time in this snapshot. Welcome back, everybody, to Dr. Sellars Educate. Our mission is simple. It is to support all nurse educators to achieve excellence in the classroom. And some colleagues may be on the mission to achieve a successful passing score on the C&E exams. Now, if you're on the journey to C&E, there will be questions on exam analysis. C&E novice and C&E clinical, you will not have questions on exam analysis, but you could have questions related to effective evaluation, and you should expect them actually when you look at competency 3, exam analysis, assessment evaluation. How do we validate that learning has happened? All of those terms under various competencies is really what we're talking about as we think about how we're going to validate that learning has actually happened. So box 25.1 is where we want you to turn to. This is where you're going to see a scenario. You're going to see some facts about the STEM, as well as those correct and incorrect answers, which we call distractors. All right, so first and foremost, print out your study worksheet if you haven't already. This is going to make sure that you stay on track as you identify what your muddy gaps are and what your next steps are going to be to close those gaps, to close the loops, to clarify any unclear concepts that you may not have a solid grasp about right now. Okay, so that's what we're talking about in this snapshot. What are the key test development components that you want to consider? And more importantly, how are you going to avoid those ineffective questions, right? We don't want to waste time. We want to maximize the time that we have with our students by developing solid questions to validate that learning has actually happened. Let's start with our thought-provoking question. Let's see what you all think. Stability of test analysis data increases as number of test takers gets closer to 100. When conducting a review of student exam scores, the faculty determined that only 30 students of the total 45 completed the exam. Based on this information, the best next step would be A, complete analysis to determine which items to nullify, B, check the number of items and test takers to verify accuracy, C, analyze exam after at least 40 students have taken the exam, or D, evaluate the mode to determine the standard deviation. Now, we know that for the C&E exam, you now have just 3 options, but this is one question that we have kept in our content. So we left it at 4 options, but just know that for the C&E, C&E clinical, and C&E novice, there are now just 3 options. There will be 3 distractors or ineffective or incorrect answers, and then you will have only 1 correct answer. Okay, so what are we talking about when we think about the term test development? Well, first and foremost, these are 2 overarching questions. How much time are you going to allocate per question? And then what questions should you include? Which questions should you not include? How do you know which questions you should include? Well, step 1, when we think about how we develop our question items, is you want to think about, for an exam, what is it that you want to identify for your students about their knowledge gap? So first is developing those questions. They should follow best practice guidelines for writing test questions. In our previous snapshot, we discussed exam blueprinting. Now, how do we make sure our exam blueprint is effective? Well, it requires mapping. We want to go back, take a look at the content that we have incorporated during that time period, of those that those questions are going to cover, that exam is going to cover. And then we want to go back and map them to our actual learning objectives. Okay, so that's a really important step. Step number 2, the question should include relevant and irrelevant data to test students' ability to differentiate important data. This goes back to our textbook on page 478. Table 25.1. Let's take a look together. So it says the STEM poses the question, right? It is written as a complete or incomplete sentence and can ask for priorities, such as what the nurse should do first. And then take a look at correct and incorrect answers. Number 1, it says keep all options grammatically consistent with the STEM to avoid giving clues to the correct answer. Let's jump down to number 6. Avoid the use of all of the above or none of the above. Students can often guess the correct answer with only partial knowledge. Multiple response type questions can be used to evaluate students' ability to cluster data. Okay, so if right now you are not engaging in this evidence-based practice for how we write effective exam questions, now is the time, right, to make those changes and think about when you revise your exams, how you're going to align it with these evidence-based practices. Okay, so let's keep going. Step 3, the STEM should be written in a precise, clear manner and not be too complex. If it's too complex, too difficult, too much content, students may spend too much time trying to understand what is this question actually asking me. Sounds familiar, right? This is a step you want to consider when you're taking the C&E exam as well. What is this question really asking me, and what is it that I know for sure? And then the STEM, as we said, looking at box 25.1, should be stated in a positive manner, and negatively written questions should be avoided. We want to make sure clue words are not included in the STEM. This is the blueprint example that we shared in our previous snapshot. The next step would be, now that we've done our blueprint, you would want to write questions, the exam questions based on box 25.1, those evidence-based practices, to align with number 1, what is the information that I expect my students to have knowledge about at this point? And then number 2 is going to be ensuring that we write that effective exam question. This is how we're going to support our trust, right? Our confidence that students are knowledgeable about these concepts. All right, so for the thought-provoking question, if you chose B, you are correct. Check the number of items and test takers to verify accuracy. Let's go back. I know it's been a little bit since we looked at the thought-provoking question. So this is the question. So if you chose B, you are correct. Let's talk about why the other options are not correct. So A, complete analysis to determine which items to nullify. That's not what the question is asking. So that's why that would not be the best answer. C, analyze items exam after at least 40 students have taken the exam. Well, that's not effective either, right? We want to evaluate and really analyze the entire exam based on the N, based on the full complement of students that have actually taken the exam. We don't want to parse out or separate subsets of the analysis. We want to look at it from a big picture standpoint, the overall effectiveness of the exam questions and the exam itself. And then evaluating the mode, same thing as number 1. It's really not related to this question. So this is why B is going to be the best answer, and it aligns with those evidence-based practices. What other steps do we want to consider? Well, Bristol and Brett talk about the 3 C's, just 3, for a successful test. Okay, so we want to go over those as well. Number 1, content will be assessed in the test. You want to nail that down. What are those concepts? What are those learning objectives that I expect my students to be knowledgeable about? Number 2, clarity. We want to write very clear questions, right? That STEM, the options, those incorrect options, and the correct answer. We want it to be very clear. You want to consider the complexity. Going back to that exam blueprint, we don't want all of our questions to be at that lowest level, the easiest level, right? We want to spread students' ability to validate that learning has happened across all of the 6 levels of the cognitive learning domain. And then we want to critique the test for quality improvement. That's a big responsibility. Let's go back, look at what the data is telling us. We can easily tell when students have done well or not done so well on the exam, but what other information can we gather from our exam analysis. We want to look at the difficulty. We want to look at the discrimination. Were we able to separate and create a large gap between how our high scoring students performed with that specific correct answer and the exam and the question? And then how did my low scoring students score as it relates to the level of difficulty with that question? It's going to help us better understand what are some of those key elements that we may need to circle back about, further clarify, have a deeper discussion with our students to validate that learning has happened. Well, we hope that some of this information has helped you feel more confident in your ability to dig deeper into test development and aligning it with exam analysis. Our primary responsibility as a nurse educator is to facilitate the learning process, right? We don't want to be the sage on the stage every single time we engage with our students. We have adult learners. We want to align our evidence-based practices with Malcolm Knowles' adult learning theory. Our ability to do that is going to help us better develop these effective evaluation tools to support the validation of knowledge. Until next time, where we'll be talking about how to go a little bit deeper into that qualitative component as well as the quantitative component for our evaluation processes that we use. Reach out if you have questions, info@drsellarseducate.com, and we look forward to seeing you in our next snapshot. Have a great one, everybody.